Hey, welcome back. So, previous video, last week, I uploaded a video entitled, "Oh my God, I'm having a baby." In quotations, I'm not having a baby. I was referencing this thing that I hear pretty often. And the gist of the video was just, if you think you might end up having a baby one day, if you think that might be like an eventual possibility for you, possibly for you in the future, whether that's an intentional thing that you might end up doing with someone, or if it's more of a accidental conception and you're just like, all right, I guess I'll carry it to term, whichever it ends up being, there are some things before you get to that point just to think about, to consider a lot more thoroughly than many people tend to, than many people seem to. And the one in that video, the gist of it again was just, if you're going to have a baby, if having a baby, you're doing a lot more than just having a baby. The baby is going to eventually become something a hell of a lot more complicated than just a baby. It's going to become, a toddler, and then a child, and then an adult. If it doesn't die, if you have a baby and it does not die, it's going to grow up, because that's what happens with babies. That's what babies tend to do. Every baby that I've ever met that didn't die grew up to be something a lot more complicated than just a baby, and that's what happens when babies don't die. So, and it's worth noting that people know this. People do know that if they are, yeah, of course, if you're to have a baby and it's to not die, eventually it's going to become an adult. But I've been thinking about it. People tend to know it in a similar way, in a very similar way in which many of us, the bulk of the people that are creating the people are quite young. They're young, and they're not really doing all that much thinking about things like the future, not really, not thoroughly, like in terms of like processing it, in terms of registering the fact that we're all going to eventually die. For example, we're all going to die eventually. Most of us are going to die rather slowly. And we know this. We know this to be true. This is one of those things that we know it, but we don't really register it. It doesn't really process when we're young and things are going well, and we're still relatively well. And we're still in possession of our health, and we haven't really had like a really a genuine confrontation with our own mortality. When you haven't had that, it's very easy to just sort of deny it and take the reality of death for granted. Your own death, because we see it all the time outside of ourselves. And even if you've a loved one has died and you've they're not there anymore, but still, like with us, it's still something that we see it outside of ourselves, and it doesn't feel real. It doesn't really truly register the fact that we ourselves are going to eventually most of us are going to grow old, and we're all going to die. And many of us are going to die rather slowly, and we know this. And this is one of those things, and I think it's very similar to the way in which many people tend to know that their babies are going to grow up into adults that'll also have to die eventually. And it's just, people do know this, but it doesn't register. It doesn't really process. So when it comes to this topic and the discussion of it, just, creating people and it being a very, very big deal, and, you should take additional precaution if when it comes to these sorts of things, I think that should be the main focus, is just trying to get more people to more thoroughly process it, to get it to really register, even just a little bit more than it does, which isn't really saying much. Again, because when we're young, and this applies to me, I've said it before and I'll say it again, I'm someone who's young and stupid and deluded. I don't believe that I'm going to eventually die. Not really. It doesn't process. It doesn't feel real. The vast majority of the time, I feel very, very distant from just how short of a period of time that I have left on this planet. Those are things that just fade into the background when you're just sort of caught up in your own shit. You're just chasing after, the daily grind of just being a human being. You tend to forget some very important things, and that's one of them. Just how short this experience that we're all having as people. It's a very short thing. It's a very short phenomenon of being alive. It can feel very long. It's all perception. It all comes down to life can feel like a very, very long thing. It's just so far time has been going by rather quickly for me personally, but that's going to vary. Just how long or short life feels to be. But yeah, when it comes to creating people and just trying to get more people to just think about it a little bit more, like the implications of creating a person. What is that really going to result in? What does that actually consist of? What does that really mean to do that? When you're trying to get people to just process it a little bit more, I think it really matters the way in which you attempt to go about doing that. Getting more people, the young people, like, early 20s, that's who's creating most of the people. Just trying to get those people to just think a little bit more about what it is that they stand to do. Because many people don't really think very far past having a baby. And then they know that like the baby's going to become a child, who's going to become a teenager, who's going to become an adult, but it doesn't really. Most people don't really take the time to process what that actually is going to look like. Like trying to be realistic about it. Like, what are the odds? If I am to have, say you're having sex with someone and you've been doing that for a little while, and you're just considering, well, if I am to conceive with this person, what are we quite likely to raise in terms of this person, this prospective person, this potential person? What are their lives going to look like? If I'm to get pregnant, or if I'm going to get her pregnant, and we're to, it's going to carry to term, what's that really going to consist of? What's that life going to look like? Are they going to be relatively content? Are they going to be able to find fulfillment in their lives? Are they going to be able to try and at least, try to justify their existence and the suffering that they'll have to face, the suffering that is inherent in every life, every human life? It's beaten to death. That horse is beaten to death, but it is true as fuck. It really is. That every human life is just immersed. It will eventually be, if they are to live that long, immersed in suffering. And when it comes to being a person and trying to make sense of that, a lot of that will consist of trying to find things that are worth struggling for, worth suffering for. It's beaten to death. It sounds so cliche, but it is true. It's one of those things that is beaten to death, but it's because it's so fucking true. If you are to have a child, are they going to, what are the odds? What are the odds that they will be able to source something like that, to find something that will actually give them a lasting sense of fulfillment in times of genuine suffering? Will they be able to find that? That's becoming something that's more difficult to source, I think. It's becoming a hell of a lot more difficult to source those sorts of lasting states, or a lasting sense of self-esteem, feeling like my existence means something. I have some modicum of value. I'm doing something that matters in some way. That's becoming more difficult for more and more people to source. And that is not a good thing. And we're human beings. So we crave that. We need that. We need that desperately. And it's easy to take that need that we do have for a sense of direction and purpose and meaning when things are going relatively well. Like when you're healthy, when you're feeling good most of the time, or relatively good, you're just kind of indulging in pleasure. And that's where most of us are when we're young. We're just sort of, we're striving after things that we think will bring us those, that sense of fulfillment that might be a bit more lasting than, or we're just indulging in just sensual pleasure, and that's a lot of that. But as you age, so I hear, it's going to become even, you're going to become more desperate, more and more desperate, exceedingly more and more desperate to justify your suffering, your continued suffering, because life is going to become more and more difficult in many ways. And you'll more and more clearly recognize that your existence isn't to be justified by pleasure, by the illusory feelings of pleasure, or I rambled a little bit. I got a little off track, but the point is, creating a person. I don't know. I think that if the main focus should be on trying to get more people to just process that just a little bit more. The fact that when you're having a baby, you're creating a person that'll eventually become quite desperate to justify their suffering. That is something I don't think many people even attempt to process. That when you're having a baby, you are creating someone who will eventually have to desperately find things that they can convince themselves of are worth striving towards to make sense of their continued existence. And many people, especially as we age, many people are kept alive, existing, not by that, but by this aversion to death, this fear of death. The procrastination of death often consists of that. It's just I'm horrified of the unknown. It's not even, I mean, for many people, it is not even about the process of dying itself. Not completely, at least. A lot of it is this just very, very powerful attachment to continued existence. Even when that continued existence becomes incredibly difficult to justify by any other means of, just trying to... I do think that's underestimated pretty often as well. When you see people who just have nothing left, who are very close to the end of their lives, and they have nothing left. You wonder what's sustaining them, what's keeping them there, what's keeping them existing, and that's oftentimes. It's also worth mentioning it's very difficult to check out around that time. It becomes more and more difficult to do that the older you get in terms of taking it into your own hands. But yeah, when you grow old, that's going to be the thing that you cling to the most, is some sense of purpose, some sense of meaning. Feeling as though you aren't just a decaying burden. That's how many people feel at the end of their lives, as though they are nothing more than just a slowly atrophying burden. That's how many people feel. And they were all babies at one point. And they were all babies, many of which were brought into being by a couple of people that didn't even for a moment consider that possibility, that they'd be an older person rotting away with just nothing left sustaining them than a very, very powerful natural aversion to death, fear of death, or just an inability to check out. That's worth considering. That's something many people don't even for a moment consider when it comes to having a baby. Just your baby's going to become an older person that's going to have just an exceedingly difficult time in justifying their continued suffering. And that is the fate of a large portion of and that's becoming a more common fate. An existence that feels as though there isn't the continued existence just doesn't make any sense outside of, well, I am horrified of the inevitable death of my sense of self and everything that I'm, the last bit of what I'm clinging to so desperately, which is oftentimes just the sustainment of the body, of the organism. And that's not talked about enough. I don't know. Hey, that's it. I just wanted to ramble a little bit. But yeah, again, when it comes to creating a person being a very big deal, that's where that area of life, I think, it really should be considered a lot more thoroughly. The fact that most of us are going to grow old, and lives are becoming more and more, We have no problem nowadays extending life, keeping people alive, keeping people breathing. That's becoming easier. And it's becoming more and more difficult to justify that continued breathing, that continued sustaining the physical vessel. It's becoming more and more difficult to do that via feelings of purpose and meaning. And I think more people should think about that. That's going to become more and more difficult to source for more and more people as they age in the future. Larger and larger portions of human beings are going to struggle in justifying their continued existence. And the last thing that will be keeping a large portion of human beings there in that state is either just inability to end their own lives, or a very, very powerful aversion to death. And that's something that really many people need to consider more deeply, who are shitting out kids without even even thinking about that. What does it mean to die? What does it mean to grow old? What does that look like? What does that consist of for so many people? For so many fucking people. What does that look like? All right, that's it. That's the video. Goodbye.